There is no food shortage in this country right now. But yet, whenever you go into the stores, you very often see bare shelves. There's items that just aren't there. So what's happening? Normally, whenever we have a shortage of something, there's something that's happening on the supply side. So for example, there could be a drought that's destroying the crops. Whenever there's a freeze, in Florida, for example, there could be a shortage of orange juice, or the price of orange juice gets very high. There's all kind of pests that can destroy crops. There's plant diseases that make them inedible. But none of that is happening right now. What's happening now is we're seeing increased demand. And it's actually artificial demand. It's not something we normally see. Whenever the economy grows, demand goes up. Whenever the economy shrinks, demand goes down. We expect that. But we normally see that in things like cars and washing machines, things that are called consumer durables. We don't normally see it in food because no matter what happens in the economy, you still got to eat, and there's a limit to how much you can eat. But what's happening now, we're having panic buying that is making this artificial demand, and it's causing a bullwhip effect that's going throughout the supply chain. The other issue that we're seeing is people are changing the way that they buy food. People actually normally buy more food in restaurants, or I should say the value of the food, not actual physical quantity of it, but they're spending more money in restaurants than they spend on food that they buy to consume at home. So that has changed very abruptly. So let's take a look at these two things that are affecting our supply chain. The first one is that panic buying that I talked about a little bit earlier. Right? So we have a virus. People are worried about that. Are they going to be able to get out of the house? Are they going to be able to go food shopping? They started buying things like produce and milk, things that go bad very quickly. But then they started buying things like canned goods, things that would keep longer. So I guess they had an experience that they didn't keep so well. Maybe we better get some other items. And they just kept buying all of these different sorts of canned goods and pasta, dried things. And the amazing one was also toilet paper, right? So somehow this virus apparently caused us to need a lot more toilet paper. But really what it was, it's a psychology that's involved with this that it makes you feel like you've got some kind of control. So you want to have control over your life, and you can do that by buying canned goods and buying toilet paper. So the psychology of this is very interesting because whenever you see these empty shelves, you worry, does somebody know something that I don't know? Right? And I first experienced this when I was maybe 22 and I was at the grocery store and I saw these empty shelves and everybody seemed kind of upset. So I stopped somebody and I said, what is going on? And he said, it's going to rain. I'm like, oh my God, it's going to rain. What, are we going to be trapped in our houses for 6 months? I thought this was crazy. And then somebody came up to me and they asked me what was going on. And I said, well, they said it's going to rain. And this guy panicked and he grabbed a loaf of bread. And I thought, well, you know what? Maybe they do know something I don't know. So I made sure that I got one too. So even I got sucked into it, even though I knew that it was crazy, because it's just, well, just in case. What does it hurt to have it? Well, it hurts it because it causes these shortages, and people who may actually need it aren't going to be able to get it. And this is where the bullwhip effect starts, and it starts going through the supply chain, that now the stores have this incredible demand that they're putting upon their suppliers. So what we then see happen is people run out of room. Their pantries are full, their garages are full, their basements are full, whatever it is that they're buying, and they finally stop buying. So you have this very high demand, and suddenly that demand collapses and it goes to zero. So in actuality, what we've done, we've shifted things from warehouses to our pantries. Because remember, most of the food that we're buying was harvested last fall. And that's one of the main reasons why there's not a shortage of food. We've had it in storage for a long time. All these canned items, the pastas, all this sort of thing. The pasta came from the wheat that was harvested last fall. So now, suddenly, there's a collapse in demand, and producers were ramping everything up, and they got to the point where they could meet this extra demand, and suddenly the demand has dropped. And that's the major issue that causes the bullwhip effect. So what happens to suppliers is they're all cranked up, they're ready to bring all this stuff in, and then suddenly the stores are ordering less. So sometimes it doesn't make that big a deal if it's just stuff that's sitting in a warehouse. Maybe they're bringing too much to the store. But if you look at products that are actually being produced now, so for example, fresh vegetables that are being produced in California or that are coming from Florida or Mexico, or another example is the mushroom industry where they're producing constantly. And you have what you see here in this photograph where now the demand went down and they've got to throw product away. So now the waste can be just tremendous. So let's take a look at the other side of the equation, and that's the changing buying habits of consumers. So over the years, and you can see from this graph in the Wall Street Journal, we've tended to purchase more and more of the food that we consume away from home as opposed to consuming it at home. So around 2007, you can see that the two lines in the graph converge because they become about equal. But then in 2008, we had a disruption, and that was because we had a recession, and people decided, well, I'm not going to go to the restaurant. It costs more money. I'm just going to buy that food at home. And I saw this when, because I was working in the mushroom industry at that time, and we saw our sales to restaurants, so we called industrial customers that go to things like restaurants and schools and universities. We saw that drop, and we saw our retail sales go up. But we were good with that because we actually had higher margins. And it happened relatively gradually. And we were able to shift over relatively easily. But then after the recession happened and the economy started picking up, you see that trend come back. We're eating more and more food away from home. But what happened this time is we had the government suddenly shut down our economy. Suddenly we're not allowed to go to restaurants. Suddenly schools are shut down. Suddenly universities are shut down. And the food away from home market pretty much collapsed. So we saw some rather interesting things happening. Like we see food that was on food docks, it's ready to go to restaurants. Now they're not moving and it's going bad sitting there. We see that milk that was meant to go to universities and schools and restaurants is now being dumped because it's a separate supply chain from the food that's going to the grocery stores. So grocery stores are actually limiting and apologizing for shortages of milk while milk is being dumped. And the reason for this is because the packaging requirements that the government has in their regulations, very different for what goes into the industrial market compared to what's going into grocery stores. And also the sizing of the packaging and the type of packaging is very different for these two different supply chains. There's a lot of specialization, and it's difficult for a lot of producers to shift over from one supply chain to another. So what you would see is even in places like particularly Florida, where they're feeding food into supply chains that go into things like Disney World that are closed down, they've got food that's rotting in the field that they can't sell. So remember I said most of the food, though, was harvested last fall, the things that went into canned goods, that sort of thing. So there is no shortage of food, but it's this big change in demand. So now how do farmers see that demand? We're coming into spring, so they've got to make planting decisions. How much are they going to plant? What are they going to plant? And then to throw another curveball into it, 40% of the corn that's planted doesn't go into the food market, it goes into the energy market. But yet they affect each other, these two markets. So with the collapse of the price of oil, will there be less demand for ethanol because there's enough oil to go around that we don't need the ethanol, right? So these are all decisions that are going to affect our supply chain going into the future. So we can complain about what happened, or we can learn from what happened. So one of the things that we need to do is improve our supply chains. They've got to be more flexible. They've got to be more responsive, but also they've got to be less specialized. We don't want to specialize in just going to the retail market or just going into the industrial market. We have to have the flexibility that we can move back and forth in between them. So we have to make sure that we have contacts and sales in both of those areas, but we also need to use just-in-time inventory methods and postponement. So we're not going to label things. We're not going to package things until we absolutely have to, so we know what market that we're going into. So we're responding to the demand rather than having to predict whatever that demand is. The other thing is we want to procure closer to home whenever we can, because by shortening that supply chain, we can make it much more responsive. And we also want to make sure that there's no price controls, because the price signal is very important. It's what signals to us that there's a shortage of something or that there's too much demand for something. And it's the only way we can increase the capacity is by having that signal, but also to have more funds that are available due to higher prices so that it's possible to increase the capacity. And the other thing that it does is it reduces the chance that people are going to hoard things, because the price is higher. They're going to decide that it's just not worth it.